Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Batman Arkham City for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Mac, and Wii U. This is an action-adventure game and the sequel to Batman Arkham Asylum. It was developed by Rocksteady Studios and published by Warner Bros. In October of 2011 for console, and then later on for PC, Wii U, and of course Mac. And it's interesting for a couple of reasons, the first of which being that it takes the Arkham Asylum general gameplay and transplants it into an open world. So there is of course the question of how well they implement an open world and what, if anything, it adds or detracts from the game. As well as the fact that it had a ridiculously positive critical reception. People generally consider this basically the best superhero game ever made, as well as one of the best games ever. At least you see that a lot. But the real question here is it really worthy of all that praise, or was that just people caught up in the moment who didn't really look as critically on it as they probably should have? Well, before we really answer that question, let's first talk about the presentation, which is pretty gorgeous. It does run on Unreal Engine 3, but the amount of detail that's been packed into basically everything in the game, from environments to character models and animation, to even simple things like cloth animation, is insane. And the game is absolutely gorgeous as a result. Really nice effects, and a lot of the physics effects that they threw in there also just bring the thing to life in a way that you don't see in other games. So it's definitely a looker. There is one major problem with it, though, and that is that it follows the whole brown and gray and realistic kind of crap, where basically everything is a shade of brown or gray, mostly gray. And while they do have some colors here and there, it's still a very dirty, grimy art style that does fit the game, but it's not exactly easy on the eyes. So it's really more the visual quality that lifts things up than the art style itself. But that said, it definitely feels like Batman from just the visuals alone. And then you get the sound design, which is still fantastic. You've got a very solid soundtrack that is definitely very fitting for Batman, and the voice cast is phenomenal, as usual. Of course, you got Kevin Conroy as Batman.
I've destroyed the containers, Bane.
And as usual, he did an absolutely phenomenal job of the character. And of course, we have Mark Hamill as the Joker.
Nothing you can teach me, Joker.
Oh, come on. There's always something to learn. Let's start with getting your ass kicked 101.
Once again. And he's pretty much the best Joker we've ever had. He is an utterly amazing voice for the Joker. And then there's the rest of the cast, which you might think would be playing second fiddle to these two guys, but the rest of the cast also rises to the occasion. Everyone else in this game is voiced extremely well, and it really does lend a lot of character to this game. They clearly put a lot of time and effort into figuring out who should play each individual character, and they clearly had very good voice direction as well. So when you get to the part of the presentation that's not quite as good as the rest, which is just the sound effects, you're pretty willing to excuse it because you got all of this other fantastic presentation to make up for it. And even then, the sound effects themselves are not bad by any means. They're just kind of average. A lot of them are basically recycled from Arkham Asylum, and unfortunately they weren't particularly great in that either. So the combat sounds, for example, just sound more smacky than hard-hitting, so they could stand to improve that a bit, but by and large the presentation is just phenomenal in this game. But opposite what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you are once again Batman, and this time it's set after the events of Arkham Asylum, and you actually end up being thrown into Arkham City as Bruce Wayne, all on orders of Hugo Strange, who is overseeing the Arkham City project, so to speak, where Arkham City is basically a section of Gotham that is cordoned off and is basically a prison city, where they just throw all the inmates from Arkham Asylum and all sorts of criminals, and in some cases not so criminals, as in political prisoners, who are all thrown in there to rot and languish. And So you find yourself in this rather grim environment, and you are trying to find out what Hugo Strange himself is up to with this whole Protocol 10 idea, finding out what that scheme actually means, because if it's Hugo Strange, it can't be something good, obviously. But after finding your gear, you are set loose into Arkham City to really just do things at your leisure, so to speak. You can follow the main storyline pretty much exclusively, but there are a bunch of side missions you can complete as well, which I will go over in a moment. But suffice to say, they threw a lot of Batman villains in here, and just Batman characters in general. From Mr. Freeze to, of course, the Joker, who is one of the main adversaries, to Harley Quinn, Bane, the Penguin, Two-Face, you name it, they're gonna be there. Or at least if they're one of the more well-known Batman characters anyway. And for the most part, they're done fairly well. They remain fairly true to their characters in the comics. But you do get the occasional oddity here and there with regards to actual plot. You see, plot is really not the strong suit of Arkham City. And the more you play the game, the more you realize this. Because as you progress through the plot, it becomes increasingly ridiculous and convoluted for no discernible reason, really. It just seems like they took as much opportunity to throw in different Batman villains as they possibly could, and they give you this incredibly stupid motivation for doing everything, which is that the Joker captures Batman and gives him a blood transfusion because the Titan formula actually started mutating in his blood and really started killing him. So that gives you the impetus to find a cure for this so you could inadvertently help Joker. And the way they resolve that plot is just, frankly, not all that great. And it does lead into the events of Arkham Knight as well, of course, with something fairly major, which I'm not going to spoil for you, but suffice to say, the plot itself just doesn't really end on a good note, and it doesn't really tie things together as well as you would hope it would. So what you're left with is a pretty mediocre plot overall, with a lot of just convoluted nonsense that they threw in there just to have some Batman villains thrown around. It feels kind of like how they did with Arkham Asylum, where it just feels like an excuse to tie the game together. And Arkham City does something wildly different from Arkham Asylum in terms of its gameplay, however. Now, I already mentioned that there are side missions, and plot-wise they're not particularly great, but they give you a variety of things to do, and of course gadgets to earn, experience to earn so you can upgrade things, that sort of thing. And as you go through the game, you're going to stumble across these side missions. They can be all sorts of different things, from doing simple investigations, which are actually the most interesting of them, to going through some pretty basic obstacle courses and things like that. And ultimately, the side missions are really hit or miss. For example, there's one that you start out really early in the game that is related to the character of Zsasz, who is this just complete psychopath who is threatening to shank people if Batman doesn't run off and answer phones. So for the first 9-ish hours or so, you're going to be having these phones pop up, to where it's answer the phone, and then you have to go find the next phone, answer that, and then do an extremely simplistic mini-game where you just track the signal, and eventually you track the guy down. But here's the problem with that, and the problem with most of the side missions in general. They don't have satisfying conclusions for the most part. They're usually just kind of tied together really simply. For example, with the Zsasz one, you quite literally just press Y to win. And you just instantly complete that side mission by pressing the Y button on the gamepad, or the counter button, whatever you've got it set to on PC. And it triggers a shortcut scene that is frankly incredibly underwhelming, and it's like, congratulations, you have completed the side mission. Now go and do other stuff. That's it? You don't get any sort of real satisfaction from actually beating the villain? You don't get a good boss fight or anything like that? Nope, it's just a straight up press Y to win. And most of the side missions are pretty much like that. They may have really cool or interesting setups, but ultimately the payoff just ends up not being worth it. Particularly with that Zaz one, where the gameplay itself for that mission was just incredibly monotonous and boring. And by the end of it, I was just begging for it to finally be over. When it was finally over, I was like, I don't have to look for the phones anymore. Holy crap! I can focus on other things. And it just feels like busy work with these side missions. That's the biggest problem I had with them. Some of them are alright, but most of them just feel like busy work. They're not really doing anything you don't already do, and they don't really seize the opportunity to actually capitalize on these various villains and their setups, and it just all falls flat. So when you're dealing with the side missions, they don't really go any better than the main missions, except the ones where you have to go around as the detective Batman. You see, Batman is supposed to be the world's greatest detective, and you get this slight glimpse of that kind of thing with some of these side missions, namely with the Deadshot stuff, where you go into this special version of detective mode and you're basically cataloging evidence, and you're watching as Batman pieces together what happened in the various situations, how he can track down these bad guys, and so on and so forth. And that stuff is really cool, even if it is really simplistic. But it's so underused. There's only a handful of missions that will actually let you do that. And they're few and far between. So it ultimately just ends up being a big letdown. Because what else are you going to do? Well, you're going to do the typical Batman Arkham Asylum stuff, just in a somewhat open world setting. What do I mean by that? Well, you still have the free flow combat system, which seems like it works a bit better on PC now. Remember, I had some issues with it actually working properly with the controls in Arkham Asylum. That seems to have been remedied now. But it's still the same. Build up a long combo and you'll be able to actually be a badass. And make sure you're spamming the counter button, because that's pretty much how you do it. It's a very timing-based system, but it's more of a rhythm timing-based system than anything else. So once you've settled into the actual rhythm, it's really not all that hard. And the only way they really throw a monkey wrench into things is when, for some bizarre reason, the counter button doesn't decide to work. Where you press the counter button, but you don't counter what they actually hit you with. And so it breaks your combo, and now you have to start all over. And you don't really do a lot of damage unless you do have a really high combo going. So that gets extremely irritating when that happens. And it really doesn't help that in an attempt to add some variety to the combat, they do throw a bunch of different enemy types at you, including Riddler informants, where once you've beaten everybody else, you can actually interrogate them with the counter button, and it will show different spots on the map for that particular area for where Riddler stuff is hidden. But it's more than just that. They throw in a lot of different enemy types, enemies with shields that you have to use a specific maneuver to actually take down, enemies who have ranged weapons, namely guns, enemies who are snipers and you have to take them out in certain ways in order to actually survive, because they actually do a lot of damage. So it's advantageous to sneak up on them. You've got big brutish enemies, you've got enemies that are armored, you've got enemies that have melee weapons, whether it be a pipe or blades, and blades have different ways of taking them down than everybody else, because you have a blade dodge takedown that you can do. I never really managed to get the timing down on that. It actually got pretty annoying, particularly when they started throwing about 10 to 15 enemies at you all at once, including a mixture of guys with shields, guys with ranged weapons, and guys with blades, and it eventually just gets to the point where it's outright infuriating. I will readily admit that this game pisses me off to no end, and it is purely because of the combat system. It is not a bad combat system. When it works, it's cool to watch, but it's a very simplistic idea that they try to flesh out by throwing in more variety and throwing more enemies, because that's apparently how they think you actually deserve a challenge. And even though it does make the game harder, it doesn't feel harder necessarily. It just kind of feels bullshitty at times. Because more often than not, when you do get hit, you're like, well, I hit the counter button, why didn't he counter? But obviously somebody who just manages to get the timing down exactly is not going to have that problem. So it's a very subjective thing as to whether or not the combat is going to feel unfair or not. I was on the borderline of declaring it unfair, but it really isn't unfair, so to speak. It's just that when your combo gets broken, it's just irritating. And that's the problem I had with Arkham City in the long run. It wasn't enjoyable. Oh sure, there were a handful of things here and there that were outright enjoyable, like the detective mode stuff. But if you do not like the free-flow combat system that they have in the Arkham games, if you've played Arkham Asylum before this and you didn't like that combo system, you are not going to like it here either. It's not really any better. They did add a few things, but it's just very incremental stuff. It is the same combat system, just done slightly more proficiently. And they didn't really improve the stealth gameplay either, so you don't really have much of an opportunity to actually avoid combat. If you go into an area, there's going to be a lot of dudes in a given area, and it's going to be kind of hard to sneak up behind them and take them all out quietly. Particularly when a lot of the enemies have heartbeat sensors that when they get knocked out, they will be alerted to investigate, and suddenly you'll have 4 or 5 guys swarming you all at once, all of them with assault rifles, and all of them just mowing you down incredibly easily unless you somehow manage to escape. They do give you some new gadgets to fiddle around with, but ultimately that isn't enough. Yes, it is nice to have new gadgets. It's nice to have new opportunities to fiddle around with new things. It's nice to have this freeze blast thing where you can freeze enemies in place or use it to solve puzzles by freezing steam pipes and things like that. But it ultimately just comes down to less enjoyable moments than there are outright infuriating ones. And in between those moments, you have a lot of dullness. Most of the time I was playing this, I was just telling the game to get on with it. I felt like it was wasting my time. And here's the problem with it. It's a well-made game, but I feel it doesn't take full advantage of Batman. Batman has all sorts of really cool villains and really cool characters, and you have so much opportunity with investigations, with being this silent strike from the shadows kind of guy, with all sorts of really, really cool gadgets, but they focused way too much on the combat, and not enough on the other elements, which are frankly more interesting than the combat. Again, this isn't a bad game, but I can't enjoy it. It's too irritating to be enjoyable. This is why I am giving this a 3 out of 5, with an asterisk. If you liked Arkham Asylum, you will love Arkham City, because it's more of the same, really, just with an open world that really isn't utilized all that well. There's not really all that much to do in terms of it being an open world game. It just feels like it's a big area to traverse from place to place, and not much else. But if you liked the way that Arkham Asylum played, and you just want something that is more of that, but with a bit more freedom to move around the world, Arkham City is the game for you. You will love it. But if you're like me, and you didn't really like Arkham Asylum in the first place, this is not going to convert you. It just feels like too much of a missed opportunity for that. And it's a real shame, because frankly, there aren't all that many good superhero games out there. This one's alright, if you can get past the infuriation that the combat system will cause if you don't manage to get the rhythm going and you don't manage to counter literally every single thing in the universe, because that's what this boils down to. But instead of feeling like the ultimate Batman experience, it feels like they were onto something, but just didn't quite grasp it. And it really doesn't help that even though they had this open world, they really just didn't know what to do with it. And as a result, it just feels like more of a gimmick than anything else. But again, it's that very conditional 3 out of 5. It's a well put together game that you're pretty much in an either love it or hate it situation for. And who knows, maybe Rocksteady will learn from their mistakes with this one and actually throw in a lot more with Arkham Knight. We'll have to see when they finally sort out the horrendous mess that is Arkham Knight's PC version. Thanks for watching.